Camping may seem like a relaxing activity, but it can truly mean the end of a relaxing activity. I am the Mysterious Narrator, and you are on the channel of horror stories. The group of hikers consisted of 4 close friends, Matteo, Magda, Lorenzo, and Andre. They were known for their adventurous spirit and their quest for unexplored places. After months of planning, they decided to spend their weekend in a forest known to be off-limits to the public. Local legends spoke of the eerie forest and mysterious disappearances, but these brave young souls were not easily intimidated. On a Friday morning, they set out for the forest, filled with excitement. The journey was long and arduous, but once they reached the edge of the forest, they felt a thrill mixed with fear. As they approached the heart of the forest, the sunlight seemed to fade and the shadows grew denser and more menacing. After setting up their tents in a clearing, they built a campfire and began recounting past adventures. The evening was quiet, but as night fell, the sounds of the forest grew stranger. Branches moved without wind, and mysterious whispers seemed to come from everywhere. As they prepared to sleep, they heard a piercing scream that froze their blood. Without realizing it, they were trapped in a nightmare they could not have anticipated. The sound of the scream continued to reverberate in their ears, even after it had faded into the night. Trembling, they tried to find a rational explanation. Maybe it was just an animal, they said, trying to calm themselves. But their eyes could not avoid the shadows that seemed to draw ever closer to the campfire. Andre, being the bravest among them, decided to investigate. With a flashlight in hand, he slowly stepped into the forest, while the others watched in fear. The shadows danced around him, and at one point, he thought he saw a silhouette moving among the trees. When he returned to the camp, he was pale and trembling. "There's something out there," he said in a low voice. "We're not alone." The group decided to stay together and take turns keeping watch, but the night was long and filled with strange noises, cracks, whispers, and invisible footsteps. At one point, Magda swore she saw a bizarre creature with glowing eyes staring at her from the darkness. No one truly slept that night. Morning brought a ray of hope, but also a terrifying discovery. Lorenzo noticed strange tracks around the camp. They seemed to be the footprints of a large bipedal creature, unlike any known animal. As they explored the area, they found signs of a struggle and shredded pieces of their clothing. Despite this, they decided to stay and try to uncover what was really happening in the forest. They set out to explore, armed with cameras and flashlights. As they advanced, the forest grew denser and darker. At one point, they stumbled upon an old abandoned cabin. It looked as if it had been deserted for decades. Inside the cabin, they found old journals and records detailing mysterious disappearances and nightmare creatures. One of the journals mentioned an entity called the Forest Shadow, which fed on the fear and souls of those who dared to enter its territory. At that moment, they heard the terrifying scream again, much closer this time. Panicked, they fled from the cabin and headed back to the camp. But the path seemed to change, leading them in circles. When they finally returned, they found their tents ransacked and their belongings scattered. Fear had reached its peak. No one wanted to stay in that cursed forest any longer. But the way out seemed impossible to find. Night fell again, bringing with it even more terrifying sounds, this time accompanied by malevolent laughter and incomprehensible whispers. As they tried to stay calm, Matteo disappeared. He had left for just a few minutes to fetch water, but never returned. Their desperate search efforts were in vain. There was no trace of him, just the oppressive silence of the forest. The remaining group was torn by panic and despair. Andre suggested they leave immediately, no matter the risks, but the forest seemed to hold them captive. Wherever they went, they encountered the same landscapes, as if the forest itself was reshaping to confuse them. Magda, the most sensitive among them, began to hear voices whispering her name and calling from the depths of the forest. In a moment of distraction, she ran towards the voices, ignoring the desperate cries of her friends. She too vanished without a trace. Andre and Lorenzo were now alone and completely terrified. Night fell once more, bringing with it an even greater terror. The creatures of the dark seemed to draw ever closer, and the forest shadow grew increasingly palpable. In an attempt to survive, the two took refuge in the old cabin, hoping to find a way to protect themselves. As they pored over the journals, they discovered a ritual to exorcise the malevolent entity. It was a fragile hope, but their only chance. With their hearts pounding, they began the ritual, reciting the incantations found in the journal. As they chanted, the forest seemed to grow increasingly agitated. Shadows formed into clearer shapes, and the creatures began to become visible. They were monstrosities from nightmares, with gleaming eyes and sharp fangs. In the middle of the ritual, Lorenzo was seized by one of the creatures and dragged into the darkness. Andre continued, battling fear and despair. At the last moment, when all seemed lost, a powerful light pierced the darkness, and the creatures vanished in a scream of agony. Morning came, bringing with it an unexpected calm. Andre was exhausted, but alive. The forest seemed to have lost its malevolent aura, but his missing friends never returned. He managed to find his way home, but the memory of that terrifying night haunted him for the rest of his life. The legend of the forest remained alive, and warnings to stay away from its territory grew even stronger. John and Mary, a young couple eager for adventure, decided to escape the hustle and bustle of the city for a quiet weekend of camping. After carefully packing their gear, they drove to an isolated and picturesque spot in the middle of a dense forest. The fresh air and sounds of nature made them feel free and relaxed, far from everyday stress. Evening came quickly, and the clear sky gradually darkened. John set up the tent in a small clearing while Mary prepared a campfire. The flames danced playfully, and the two shared stories and laughter in the warm light of the fire. But soon, the peace of the forest was interrupted by a distant roar that turned into a threatening thunder. The storm hit without warning. The wind began to blow with unprecedented force, and the torrential rain turned the clearing into slippery mud. John and Mary hurried to take shelter in the tent, but the strong wind tore it from its roots and hurled it into the night. Desperate and soaked to the skin, they searched for a solution. Through the curtain of rain, John spotted the silhouette of an old, abandoned cabin. Without further hesitation, they headed towards it, hoping to find shelter until the storm subsided. When they reached the cabin, the door creaked in the wind. They pushed it open and hurried inside, trying to escape the fury of nature. As soon as they crossed the threshold, the door slammed shut behind them with a deafening noise. John tried to open it again, but it was locked. Without any explanation, they were trapped. The interior of the cabin was dark and freezing. The old and dusty furniture exuded an oppressive atmosphere. The flashes of lightning revealed shadows on the walls that seemed to move and come to life. A sense of unease settled in their hearts as they tried to find a solution to escape this unexpected trap. As the hours passed, the atmosphere became more and more terrifying. John and Mary began to hear whispers and unseen footsteps throughout the cabin. Old mirrors reflected faces of unknown people and dark shadows. Terrified, Mary clung to John's chest, and he tried to comfort her, though he himself felt chills down his spine. Suddenly, a dark figure appeared at the end of the hallway. The silhouette approached slowly but with sinister determination. It was the spirit of the cabin, a lost soul condemned to haunt those places for eternity. John and Mary realized they had to find a way out before the spirits caught them. John explored every corner of the cabin, searching for an escape route. Finally, he discovered a hidden trapdoor under a dusty rug. He opened it and saw a staircase descending into a dark basement. With no other options, they decided to descend. The basement was damp and cold, and the air was heavy to breathe. At the end of the basement, they found a small door leading outside. John opened it and saw the desolate forest, dimly lit by the full moon. They rushed out, but as Mary stepped out, a dark and spectral arm grabbed her by the leg, pulling her back into the cabin. John screamed desperately and tried to pull her back, but the spirit's force was too great. With a broken heart, he was forced to continue his escape into the forest, leaving behind Mary's desperate screams. In the darkness of the forest, John realized he would never be the same again, forever marked by the terrors of the cursed cabin. It was a cold autumn night when Bob and Anthony decided to go camping in the middle of a dense forest, far from civilization. The forest was known for its dark legends and stories about spirits that haunted the place. Bob, a paranormal enthusiast, suggested the idea of trying a spirit invocation ritual, and Anthony, always eager for adventure, agreed enthusiastically. As they set up their tent, the oppressive silence of the forest was broken only by the occasional sounds of nocturnal creatures. The old trees with their gnarled branches seemed to watch them menacingly. Once they finished their preparations, the two lit a campfire and began setting up the items needed for the ritual. Bob and Anthony drew a circle around the campfire using the salt they had brought specifically for this occasion. In the middle of the circle, they placed black candles and mysterious symbols that Bob had found in an old book of black magic. The atmosphere grew increasingly eerie, and the air seemed to grow heavier with each passing minute. Starting the incantations from the book, Bob and Anthony felt a sudden change around them. The wind began to blow harder, and the fire seemed to dance in an unnatural way. The shadows of the trees moved strangely, as if they were alive. At one point, a terrifying sound echoed through the forest, as if a distant hoarse scream was warning them to stop. In the midst of the incantations, the candles began to flicker violently, and the fire abruptly went out. A dense, cold mist rose from the ground, enveloping the two young men. From the mist emerged ghostly figures, dark spirits with disfigured faces and eyes gleaming with hatred. Bob and Anthony tried to run, but their legs felt heavy, as if they were rooted to the spot. The spirits approached slowly, whispering unknown words that echoed in their minds. Anthony shouted at Bob to continue the ritual, to find a way to stop the spirits, but Bob was paralyzed with fear. At that moment, an invisible force lifted both of them into the air and slammed them violently to the ground. From the mist, alongside the spirits, monstrous creatures began to appear. They had deformed bodies, rotting skin, and sharp claws. The monsters emitted guttural sounds, advancing toward the two young men. Bob and Anthony were trapped between the encircling spirits and the approaching monsters. Anthony tried to use his pocket knife to defend himself, but the monsters were too strong. One of the monsters grabbed Anthony and dragged him into the darkness of the forest, while another attacked Bob. Their desperate screams were swallowed by the night. The next morning, the forest was quiet, as if nothing had happened. Alarmed by their absence, the friends and family of the two young men set out to find them. They found the empty tent, the broken salt circle, and signs of a struggle. The campfire was extinguished, and the books were scattered on the ground. But there was no trace of Bob and Anthony. The police investigations led nowhere, and the two were declared missing. The locals began to avoid the forest, and the stories about the dark spirits and monsters that haunted the place grew even more terrifying. Since then, no one has had the courage to camp in that cursed forest, and the story of Bob and Anthony remained a chilling warning about the dangers of the unknown. Andrew, a young vlogger passionate about the paranormal, was always on the lookout for sinister locations to grow his audience. The abandoned cemetery on the outskirts of town seemed like the perfect place for a night of filming. He had heard many legends about restless spirits haunting the overgrown graves. Determined to face his fears and capture evidence on video, he prepared his equipment and headed to the cemetery at sunset. The cemetery was isolated, shrouded in an oppressive silence, with wild vegetation making its way among the old, cracked tombstones. Andrew set up his tent near a dilapidated mausoleum, ensuring he had a good view for his camera. Despite the cold and the sense of unease surrounding him, his excitement for what he might discover was stronger. As darkness settled over the cemetery, Andrew began to explore. The dim beams of his flashlights revealed strange silhouettes among the graves. As he made his way through the tombstones, he noticed shadows moving at the edge of his vision. At first, he thought it was just his imagination. But when his cameras started capturing inexplicable movements, he realized he was not alone. Time passed slowly, and the unease in his heart grew. In a moment of absolute silence, a sharp sound of breaking branches echoed behind him. He turned quickly but saw nothing. He continued his exploration, his heart pounding wildly in his chest. Approaching the oldest part of the cemetery, he felt a cold, oppressive presence, as if something or someone was watching him from the shadows. After a few hours of filming and exploring, Andrew returned to the tent to rest his feet and check the recordings. However, to his surprise and horror, the tent was gone. Where he had left it, he found only a deep, dark pit. Panicking, he began to shout for help, but his voice was lost in the night. Curiosity and despair pushed him to approach the edge of the pit. He glanced down and saw that it seemed bottomless, dark, and sinister. As he tried to understand what had happened, he felt the ground give way beneath his feet and fell into the void. Andrew landed on a thick layer of wet earth in a space that seemed much deeper than he had imagined. He tried to get up, but every movement was hindered by fear and confusion. He turned on his flashlight and looked around, but the walls of the pit were so high and straight that it was impossible to climb. As he tried to find a way out, the sound of shuffling footsteps was heard above. Andrew looked up and saw a dark figure holding a shovel. The mysterious figure began to throw dirt into the pit, slowly but steadily. Andrew began to shout desperately, but the response was only silence and the sinister shadow working methodically. With each shovelful of earth, the space in the pit shrank, and the air became harder to breathe. Andrew fought to stay calm, but the fear of being buried alive overwhelmed him. He used his last strength to scream and try to climb the walls of the pit, but it was in vain. Eventually, the earth reached his chest, then his neck. The last thing he saw was the dark silhouette of the man with the shovel, throwing one more shovelful of earth over his face. Andrew was buried alive, with no one ever knowing his fate. His camera, still running, was buried along with him, a silent witness to his final adventure. In the days that followed, the abandoned cemetery remained just as silent and sinister, hiding its secrets beneath the cold ground. Vloggers who heard about Andrew's disappearance avoided the place, and the legends about haunting spirits grew darker. Andrew, passionate about the paranormal, had become part of the cemetery's sinister story himself. I have been the Mysterious Narrator, and I'll see you in the next video.